it's always going to be a this. But is that the same? And as I'm thinking this through now, you'll pardon me for thinking as I'm talking. Not quite. Right? In other words, Thomas's move is that much more radical. In other words, it's not just that the essence is a this, but the thisness, the esse being raised, as it were, above essentia. The thisness is, if I can use the language of thinking now occurring by analogy, it's an absolute thisness, right? It's, in other words, it's not that an essence must be instanced in Aristotle in order to be a genuine essence. It must be some this or other. Now, I think in terms of natural essences, it's easier to imagine. The species horse for Aristotle must always be in this or that horse. Right? In other words, it doesn't exist, as it were. It doesn't be apart from its concrete instancing in this or that horse. Right? But it's a matter of indifference. Ultimately, how can I put it? In other words, it really, as long as it's in some horse or another, then the Aristotelian essence horse is real. Right? It's in some horse or another. But that horse doesn't have any absolutely special dignity of its own. You see what I'm driving at? It's a little difficult to formulate. But so in other words, the specialness, right? In other words, so when Thomas is talking about the creation of something as distinct from others, it's a special creation. I guess it's a better way of putting it, right? Thisness there is an absolutely specific thisness, if I can put it that way, for want of a better way of putting it, that is absent in Aristotle. Right? So Aristotle has this notion of that the essence is somehow or other an existing individuality, is the way I put it in chapter 1 of Novitas Mundi. Yes, it is an existing individuality, but it need not be, even though, and therefore it's a this, something, you say, but it need not be this as opposed to that. As long as there's some or another this to incorporate it, that's all Aristotle demands, and that's as far as Aristotle's mind can reach, because he doesn't have any notion of a universal agent who is the active producer, right, of the whole, of the totality of being, right? So, and that's part of the paradox is when we think of totality, therefore, we have to be very careful, understanding, certainly in Thomas, that the totality, since there is no universal matter, as he says on page 14, there is no universal matter, then the totality of being is not adequately understood as simply in terms of universality, but it needs to be immediately understood in terms of perpetuality or particularity, right? So the totality of being is composed, as it were, of beings who are equally created as totalities within what otherwise might be the framework of the totality of beings. Right? Yeah.
It's almost as if Aquinas is on the way of thinking of essence as if it were accidental.
Well, it's an issue for him.
Yes.
Yes, it's an issue for him. Or I don't know whether it's essence is accidental, but that being is accidental. In other words.
Well, what I'm meaning is that in the modern world,
right,
it's easy to understand how a given object exists, but only has its essence by virtue of its social context or its definition within some use, and so forth. So you have an object, but it's the object. Its thisness is independent of what it is, because what it is something that's determined by how it's used. Or
when you say that, I think immediately of somebody like Sartre, and therefore I want to say that's a radically subjectivistic notion. It's a very interesting notion.
But I'm saying it's in a sense this is setting that up, because if there's this distinction between
well, in the broad sense, he's setting up in a way the whole of modernity. And yes, in particular, in distinguishing esse from essentia, he sets up a whole range of possibilities. That's right, from Leibniz through Sartre. Okay. Now this issue we keep coming back to it, so I won't dwell on this particular page. On page 16, just generalizing the distinction, the novelty, as it were, that he introduces into the discussion of essence. On page 16, in the first paragraph beginning on that page, in Summa Contradentilis 252, he says, although intellectual substances, by which he means, by the way, angels, right? This is his way of speaking of angels, is the beginning of the decadence of Greek civilization, magnified by Plato. He spent a lot of time, I think, on Plato. I don't know how much he has to say about Aristotle, as I recall, but it would carry over to Aristotle. The notion, in other words, that it was in the decadent period, the decline of Greece, that philosophy emerges, and the essential characteristic of that decadence is the separation of reason, for Nietzsche now, the separation of reason from life. Say, the abstract reason that exists, that does not exist, as I think, I don't know if I quoted here, I think I do, but it comes up again in the body of the text. It's not that Nietzsche is altogether opposed to the notion of reason, as he makes importantly clear, but whatever reason there is, as he puts it very nicely, is in reality. It's not something beyond the immediate reality of our experience. And that, by the way, would be another point of contact with the thinking now occurring, in the sense that the thinking now occurring understands that the world that in fact is being created is, in some sense, rational through and through, intelligible through and through, insofar as it is an act of creation. Yeah, okay, so no, that's...
I had a question on page 12.
Roman numeral again?
Yes.
Okay.
It's not so much a question, but you mentioned, for example, last time that you were not going into Levinas at this point.
Yeah,
but
I mean, I could have. I just wanted to,
right,
I wanted to cover the
But I
Simon.
just wanted a sort of a reminder that
Okay.
there's an important sentence here that I don't understand, and I don't have to have it clarified now, but that we will go into it at some point. Because in the middle of that paragraph, the second paragraph.
Second paragraph on 12?
On 12.
All right, so the bottom paragraph.
Yeah, but
Okay.
it's more towards the upper part of that.
Okay.
The new thinking, now in effect, now beginning, is in effect the recovery after Levinas of the truth of Augustine.
Mm-hmm.
There are several questions that I would have after Levinas, but what I really want to say is something to come back to, which you probably will as you go into.
Well, I think we will, but let me try give you a preliminary idea. The next sentence is an attempt to explain what that means. In other words, a recovery after Levinas of the truth of Augustine. It is thinking coming into existence without not being the object of sense perception and immediate cognition, and without the transcendence of life not beginning. So it's after Levinas, insofar as Levinas prescinds, you could say. He goes back, as we'll see more thoroughly in the text when we deal with Levinas, he goes back before to what he would call, and does call, the hither side of the point of beginning. All right. So in other words, he's in a kind of beginningless, but the point being pre-beginning, diachronous temporality, in which everything is kind of given immemorially, right? So in other words, it's the burden that the self feels vis-a-vis the other is an immemorial burden which has no beginning and no end. So I might play with Levinas a little bit and say it's otherwise than beginning, using his own way of thinking. In other words, it's where he's at, the ultimate reality for him, or at least the reality he wants to focus on, is the reality which is before the beginning, in the sense that it's beyond beginning and end. So beginning and end he associates with consciousness, right? So the thinking now occurring is in the beginning. It's not quite the direct opposite, but in this sense it's a perfect opposition, in the sense that in the thinking now occurring, every now is the beginning of the universe. So you could say in the thinking now occurring, far from being beyond beginning and end, you say we're into, I want to say, I'm speaking loosely now, a kind of absolute amplification of the notion of beginning and end, and that comes out in the more technical and careful way in the appendix following chapter 7, where I which I may allude to in the explanation here. No, I don't think I can explain it. Where I speak of the thinking now occurring, the apocalyptic God is the God who is the beginning and end of the beginning and end, right? So it's not only that the thinking now occurring is into the beginning in the, how should we say, the historical, traditional, philosophical sense of consciousness having a beginning. I mean, Descartes is a concrete example of some kind of important notion of starting afresh, of beginning, right? Now, he's not talking about beginning ex nihilo, creation ex nihilo, but nevertheless, consciousness in general is concerned with the question of beginning and end. When we get to Hegel, I don't know that I make this point in one of these texts. When you get to Hegel, you have God as the beginning and end of the cosmos. I mean, that's really what he's saying, all right? And then the question is, really the problem for Hegel is not so much that God is the beginning and end of the world, but to understand for Hegel more precisely what is the relationship between the beginning and end of the beginning and the end of the world which God is. You see, in other words, so that for Hegel the beginning is the result. Right? So we have this infinite dialectical relationship between beginning and end. The thinking now occurring wants to cut through that, or wants to cut the Gordian knot there, and not so much deny. It doesn't want to deny the notion of beginning and end of the world. Wouldn't want to do that, but it wants to go beyond the notion of the beginning and end of the world, which for Hegel God is. So let me just interrupt myself, put a little parenthesis here. What we're really talking about in Hegel, which is clear and explicit in Hegel, is the absolute idea of God. Okay, so if we think of modernity beginning with Descartes as into the idea of God on one or another level, right? So in a kind of relatively naive way in Descartes, in a critical way in Kant, you see, and in an absolutely, maybe Hegel is the absolutely naive critical thinker, right? But in any event, we're always dealing with the idea of God in one form or another. Even when we jump over to America, for all the differences, important differences between the absolute self-consciousness of Hegel and the relative, irreducibly relative and real self-consciousness, or the irreducible objectivity of American self-consciousness, even so, we're still dealing with God as an idea. To say an idea, however, now that is evolving, to say, as we know from Emerson and Peirce, is growing and evolving somehow or other in a way that it's inseparable from the evolution of the cosmos. All right. So what I'm getting at is the apocalyptic God of the appendix will be the God who is the God beyond the idea of God, if I can put it that way. And therefore, it's not so much a question of eliminating the notion of the beginning and end of the world, but it's eliminating the notion that the beginning and end of the world, how can I put this simply, eliminating the notion that the beginning and end of the world is the last word in beginning and end, right? So that there is a beginning and end of that beginning and end of the world, and that is the radical and absolute interruption, otherwise called the absolute discontinuity of the continuum, you see, and it's that absolute interruption, which in a way is one way of trying to get a sense of what the thinking now occurring is all about. It's that absolute interruption, which in another context is the absolute now in which the world is being created in an absolutely particularized sense, right? Not in this total globalized sense of self-consciousness, but in the absolute, to borrow a little bit from Badiou, despite all the differences, in an absolute, in a world in which being is absolutely a multiple, absolutely multiplied, right? Or in the language that we coined here over the last year, in which ontology is polyontology. All right. Okay, so that's one.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
What was it said? I am the Alpha and the Omega.
I didn't get the first part of the question. Who said it, or
Yeah.
God says that?
Right.
Yeah, he's. I am the Alpha and the beginning and the
Where
end.
is that?
Well, it's in the Book of Revelation, which is, and it's also in what, Isaiah, I guess. So it's in the Old Testament and the New Testament, almost the same
Now,
way.
is that Greek?
Well, the Alpha and the Omega is Greek, yeah.
Yeah, so God spoke Greek.
He's very adaptable, and so when he was talking to the people of the first century AD, all the educated members of which civilization spoke their lingua franca, their equivalent of educated English was Greek. Yeah.
But
so
when that was written, was that intended somehow or other to bring in Greek philosophy into the understanding of God?
I don't know that it was intended.
I mean, I don't know what
it
the.
would be put in terms that a Greek intellectual, I suppose, could relate to. If
Well,
that's what you mean.
it's like ABC. I mean, it's the Alpha and the Omega. It's the alphabet.
Well, I
It's
know,
like
but
I'm the
why
A and
wouldn't
the
it
Z.
be said in? Well, I mean, I am the Alpha and the Omega.
Right.
That wasn't disturbed in subsequent translations. I mean, it was left in the
literally. That's right.
left in the
Yeah.
Greek, right? Whereas everything else was translated into Latin.
Oh, I think I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why in the English version?
Well, you couldn't translate it really. I don't know what you would translate. A and Z.
Well, I mean, is it something other than? Certainly, Alpha and Omega sounds more exotic, minimal, right?
Yeah.
Than A. I am the A. And the
You
Z.
have to realize that it's
and
only
Z
in
is
it's
the
only in
same.
our lifetime that educated people were not conversant with Greek, right? I mean, anybody who was born in the 19th century had any kind of education studied Latin and Greek. I mean, it just was not an issue.
I know, but they didn't translate it in the. What was the massive Latin translation? The Vulgate.
The Vulgate.
Yeah. So they didn't translate.
Oh, well, I don't know. That's a good
translated
question. I'd have to
everything
go back. I'm assuming it
into Latin,
right.
but they didn't translate this into Latin. They stuck with the Greek.
I'm assuming that they transliterated the Greek, but I don't know that. I'd have to go back and look at the Vulgate text to confirm that. But I'm not sure what's the point of your question.
Well, God said, "I am the
Alpha and the Omega.
I am the beginning and the end."
Yes.
Right?
Right.
But you're contradicting God here. Is that because he's
No, I'm
involved
explaining
with something?
God.
Oh, you're explaining.
I'm helping make
I
it
feel
clear.
better. Thank you.
No, I'm not saying he's not the
Don't
beginning.
worry about any lightning bolts.
He's the beginning. What I'm saying is that when God says, "I am the beginning and the end," he is not saying what he is too easily taken to be saying by Hegel and self-consciousness, that he is the beginning and end of the world. In other words, his being the beginning and end is not conditioned by and tied to the world. That's the point. And that would be that's an implication. I mean, I'm not inventing this out of whole cloth, although my text may be original in a certain particularity, but the point being that that's implicit in the notion of creation ex nihilo. Right? In other words, that God who creates ex nihilo is not in any sense in his being intrinsically a function of the world that he creates. So therefore he cannot be the beginning and the end of the world in any serious sense.
He
Right?
was speaking loosely.
No, he was speaking precisely. Right? Because he didn't say, if he wished to have said so, he might easily have said, "I am the beginning and the end of the world," because then Jim will understand it easily. Well, I think so, because if I am the beginning and the end, it's otherwise than I normally think, because it's identifying, there's nothing in between, so to speak, right? So when you think of the beginning of something and the end of something, but it's analogous again to the famous statement that he makes to Moses, "I am who am," or "I am that I am," so that's also otherwise than we normally think.
I mean, the beginning and the end, in the sense, is almost not part of that of which it is the beginning and the end.
Yes.
That's the sense.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Going back to Waltraud's question, the other thing there is thing coming to is this is with the first part of that sentence that I just read, without not being the object of sense perception and immediate cognition. It's Augustine in that sense. This is very cryptic and very succinct, right? But in other words, and this may come out more thoroughly in the text as we go along, but I think I've mentioned this before. Augustine has a notion of faith which is very, I want to use this word not in a technical sense, although it may be a technical sense, it's very pragmatic. In other words, he doesn't have the notion, when Augustine talks about faith, he has an epistemological notion of faith, is what I want to get at, right? And his notion, and it does come up in a different context today, but he would distinguish faith in Christ from, let's say, knowing Christ, right? And faith in Christ is faith in the Word become flesh. And it's a matter of faith because it's the word perceived in the technical sense. The word presented, as it were, sensibly, right? And as a good Neoplatonist, Augustine cannot imagine that I can know that a sense object can be the object of knowledge. See? So this goes back to Plato. Plato, remember that fourfold line in the Republic? The intelligible world and the sensible world, and each of them analogously divided into a world, the intelligible world, the lower part being the realm of thinking, dianoia, the realm of mathematical, formal thinking, reasoning, and the upper realm being the realm of noesis, of intellection, of the immediate knowledge of the ideas. All right, that's a distinction that Plato makes. In the sensible world, analogously, there are two levels. The lowest of those levels in the sensible world being the world of imagining, ekasia, images, shadows would be examples of imagining, and maybe dreams, all those imaginings. And then the highest level of the sensible realm is the level that Plato labels pistis, faith. Okay? So that notion of faith as being the mode of cognition appropriate to sensible things is applied by Augustine to faith in the incarnate word, qua incarnate. See what I'm saying? And then he understands that it was, I think I said this in another sense, and again, he's very down to earth. What he's really saying, I don't know whether you put it so crudely, but in effect, he says, if he doesn't say very closely this, it's God's way of catching our attention, because as you can see from today's assignment, Augustine is very much of the mind that most of the time our minds are lost in sensate objects, so much so that the mind confuses itself with those objects of its sensible experience, right? And so the whole methodology of Augustine is for the mind to learn to distinguish itself from the sensible objects with which it is habitually filled, and in a certain sense to withdraw and separate itself from the sensible aspects of things. Once it does that, then it enters into a realm of knowing. You see, it enters into a world of thinking, properly speaking. Okay, and since the mind, this is reminding me, this is completely off the wall, but it reminds me of, what's his name? Merleau-Ponty and his, the phenomenology of perception. It's really interesting, very interesting. Merleau-Ponty is an Augustinian. But it's the notion, in other words, that we are habitually, it's a variation on the Heideggerian notion that we're thrown into the world, right? And really the point, I think, in Heidegger and in Merleau-Ponty, and maybe it goes back to Augustine, the problem is we're thrown into the situation, and it goes back to Plato too, see? And we're thrown into we're born in a cave, right? And we're born looking at the shadows of reality, right? And it takes some doing. We're lucky, you see, if something occurs that calls our attention to the fact, you see, that what we take for granted as the ultimate reality is nothing more than a shadow, in Platonic terms, of that ultimate reality, right? And so Augustine, taking this in a religious, Christian context, of course, I think he wrote to some friend of his whose, I don't know, his daughter or his wife had died, you know, and I mean, it's a little, I'm oversimplifying it, but basically congratulating him on this opportunity, you know, for him to get straight what's what, you know, what the reality of our existence is, you see. Now that's it seems like a very harsh notion. Augustine had a certain harsh side to him, but the point is not unique to Augustine. It goes back to Plato, and so we're born into a world in which we are uncritically, we accept our experience uncritically, you see, as somehow the ultimate reality, and wisdom, in one way or another, consists in coming to distinguish the uncritical experience from a reality, whatever the reality may be for the individual thinker. All right. However, having said all of that, the thinking now occurring is reckless, okay? Because the thinking now occurring wants to say, because of certain very important changes that will have taken place in the last several thousand years, all of which are somehow or at least centered in the notion of the incarnation and its effect in consciousness and in thought, that at this point in time, as it says, I think in the last chapters of, and the last chapter in particular, Foundation, omnipotence itself is sensible, right? Very omnipotence is essentially sensible. That in fact, the distinction between, so in other words, it's the thinking now occurring wants to deny not only the rather specialized and original Platonism of our friend Badiou, but Platonism in general. It wants to deny, and therefore that aspect of Augustine, which is a hangover from his Neoplatonic mindset, it wants to deny the distinction between the sensible reality and some other reality, right? So, I mean, kill a lot of birds with one stone with this move, right? Not only Plato, but also Kant, and so forth and so on, right? So we can return to Augustine, this is the way it's a matter of reading the text properly, right? After Levinas, so it's not a simple return to Augustine, right? It's a return to Augustine's notion that somehow the sensible plays a role in our salvation. That much he had. That was clear to him. And in that respect, by the way, even though he set it up in a Platonic way, he was already beyond Plato. So I mean, it's not an either-or in Augustine's case, right? Yeah.
Sensible plays a role in Plato too. It's in Symposium. It's the way in which you come to the intelligibles is through a ladder of ascent through the sensible.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Okay, well, that's the best I can do for that one now. Okay, if there are any other questions, then I'll try and get back to where I was going to go on page 6, which is I think more or less where we had arrived last time. And in the middle of page 6, which I don't think I got to, but which is one of the other things that jumped out at me as I was reviewing the text for this course. Just a little bit above the middle of page 6, maybe a third of the way down, actually, where it says Enneads 5:10. Further, quoting Plotinus, it is the good, since being a power, being effective outwardly, it is the cause of the intelligent and intellective life, as of life and intellect. For these grow from it as from the source of essence and of existence. The source as being one where all else has duality, simplex and first, because before it was nothing. This producer, unquote, this producer of the produced, which is this maker of what has come to be made, does not have any need of his derivatives. He ignores all that produced them, all that produced realm, all that produced realm, never necessary to him, and remains identically what he was before he brought it into being. He never was the all. That would make him dependent upon the universe. Transcending all, he was able at once to make all things and to leave them to their own being. He above, unquote. Now this is very relevant to what I was saying about the thinking now occurring over against Hegel. It's very relevant to what I was saying about the I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, being something to be distinguished from I am the beginning and the end of the world, as Hegel takes it to say. But my original point, now that I've got the latest thing I said wrapped into this thought now, but my original, what really caught my attention when I was rereading the text was, wow, the whole point in the ethics seminar, it's there all in the thinking now occurring, but really emphasizing the ethics seminar is that the role of omnipotence, to say, is really not a matter of discrimination. It's a matter of, if I put it a little loosely, empowering, right? But then in effect, you see, the flip side of the absolutely creative act of God is to create, and that's again in the comparison to the continual withdrawal in Kierkegaard's notion of omnipotence, that yes, God, only omnipotence can create independent being, and the thinking now occurring saying, yeah, right on, but wait a minute, independent being, but only by continual withdrawal, only by in some sense that withdrawal continuing to support its independence. And in the seminar I said, well, what we need to understand in the thinking now occurring is that omnipotence makes a clean break of it, right? That it's so when I look back at Plotinus now, I'm saying, wow, that's a point of contact. That's frightening because this is not supposed to be Neoplatonism. but I want to go slow on that. In other words, I want to emphasize that fact. In other words, in Plotinus, there is something of which the thinking now occurring is reminiscent, that is in some sense, all right, now this is, we have to rewrite this now, but just say it boldly, a kind of indifference of what for Plotinus is the creator to the creation. He leaves it on its own, leaves it to its own being, so forth and so on. The difference, of course, would be what's missing in Plotinus, as it were, and I assert, and probably unprovable, it's just obvious, that it's missing not by accident, because historically, of course, Plotinus is dealing in a world that's in the process, in fact, of being infiltrated by Christianity, right? By a notion on many different levels that involves the creation of the world ex nihilo, and more particularly, insofar as it's Christian, involves the notion of incarnation, right? Well, so what I was about to say was, the Plotinian notion of the indifference, the ignorance, the leaving of the creation to its own being, so to speak, as far as that goes, should remind one of the thinking now occurring, but it's essentially qualified, the thinking now occurring, by the notion that, as it turns out, and this is kind of the Augustinian notion, you see, and somewhat ironically, that the means by which this liberation, this perfect liberation of the creation from the creator is effected in Christianity, and in the thinking now occurring, is, you might say, Kierkegaard would like to say this, at least paradoxically, if not absolutely so, by means of an incarnation, by means of a kind of profoundly intimate involvement with the creation, is the way, you say, in the thinking now occurring, in which the creation is given its independence. And in that sense, we'd have to part company, and do, in fact, part company from Plotinus, because in that sense, I mean this in a technical sense, minimally, the creator suffers the independence of the creation. I don't mean necessarily that the creator is in pain, but what I mean to say is that he bears up, and in the language of the seminar, omnipotence embodies just the absolute differentiated reality, which is the creation, embodying it in the sense that there is now, in a certain sense, there's no gap between the embodying by omnipotence and the creation, right? Okay, so yeah.
It seems to me that I would parse the difference with Plotinus in a couple of different sites, actually.
Okay.
That, first of all, the separation has to be seen in the light of the fact that this is an emanationist construction in which it actually is continuous.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
so that means that the point of the separation is not to talk about something as if there's a being here, a gap, and another being, the first God, the second God, but that insofar as we can talk about the first, we have to separate it absolutely from what we're doing when we're talking about the second.
Okay.
So in that sense, the separation isn't what you say it is. I say it isn't like TNO. The separation is not. Yeah, I'm just saying.
You're giving another angle on it. Yeah. Okay.
Now the other thing is that insofar as is he responding to incarnationism, and there doesn't seem to be any evidence for that. But there is evidence.
It's true. It's no evidence.
there is evidence that he's responding very strongly against Gnostic Christianity.
Okay.
And Gnostic Christianity, what? In Gnostic Christianity, there is a radical separation between a creator God that is outside of the picture.
Yeah.
And an evil creative God,
Okay.
that's creating the world, and he's in strong opposition to that. So, again, the thing that he's reacting against would be something in that idea of the separation.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying? In other words, that if he's seeing incarnation, it isn't clear whether he's seeing incarnationism at all. But if he's seeing Christianity, he's seeing some kind of a radical transcendence
A kind of
of
dualism,
the
you
creator.
mean?
Well, I don't
Okay.
like all the dualism talk.
Right.
I think that's very misleading. But
Okay.
but there is this transcendence of the ultimate of the good from the creator. The good is not the creator. The creator is something that's goofed and is created by some kind of a catastrophe.
Okay, that's fair.
When you say it's true, but there's no evidence, you've been talking to Dan Rather again?
Yes, that's where I get all my.
Donald Rumsfeld.
Okay. All right, but to go back to Plotinus himself, without saddling him with everything that's happened in the meantime, at the end of that middle paragraph on page 6, this unmade maker, God beyond the made God, who contains all as the form of all, is beyond not only movement but also rest, beyond the very distinction upon which Aristotle's notion of the unmoved mover rests. Finally, Plotinus says, quote, we rob it of its very being as the absolute good if we ascribe anything to it, existence or intellect or goodness, unquote. The approach to the infinite energy, which is the one, is not through knowing. The one is beyond knowing and not knowing. In Enneads 696, Plotinus says, quote, unity, self-present, it has no need of self-intellection. Indeed, this self-presence were better left out, the more surely to preserve the unity. We must eliminate all knowing and all association, all intellection, whether internal or external. It is not to be thought of as having, but as being intellection. Intellection does not perform the intellective act, but is the cause of the act in something else. And cause is not to be identified with cause. Most assuredly, the cause of all is not a thing within that all. I think we touched on this generally last time. I don't remember this particular passage, but this is the passage in which you can, in which he says very explicitly that the one is the active intellection of the secondary God, right? Is the active intellection of the knowing, which the na'im, or of the nous, of the mind, which is the secondary God. So the one is beyond mind, it's beyond knowing, right? But it is the act of knowing in the sense that it's the cause of the actual knowing that takes place in and as, if I can put it that way, the secondary God.
It's not an act. It's not that later Aquinian recuperation of
Right.
Aristotle. It's not that it's the act of knowing, it's the cause of the act of knowing in the other.
Okay, now this is where we get into translation, right?
Well, okay.
And by the way, when I was reading today's assignment in Augustine, I usually very empathetic with Augustine, because Augustine's whole problem is the difference between the meaning of words in Greek and in Latin.
Yeah.
That's one of the major obstacles he has to sorting out how to understand the Trinity. But if you look at the Greek that I quote here at the bottom of 6, noesis, da ou nae, I mean, that is, I'm translating noesis. Now, you could take issue with this, but I'm translating noesis as the act of knowledge, the act of intellection. To distinguish.
I think, isn't he distinguishing? Maybe not. Maybe not.
I mean, because then he goes on to say al-itia, that's the cause, right? So what I'm translating as the intellective act, noesis, the intellective act, but not the knowing, not the.
Yeah, but the sentence says intellection does not itself perform the intellective act. So there's a distinction between the elective act and this noun that's not a noun, this thing that is beyond what language can do and can only be indicated, which he wants to say it's not that it's unrelated to intellection. In fact, it's the cause of the elective act, but it's not self-doing it. It's not thinking in any sense that you could find, and yet it is the very cause of the possibility that there could be such a thing.
Okay. And now we have a among other things, we have a semantic problem here, how act is being used. Right?
Yes. Well, I'm just worried that it's sliding into what's a later usage.
Well, I'm not sure.
I mean, you want to take energeia and put it at the level of the one, and I'm not sure that that's.
Well, he definitely refers to the one as energeia. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, then
that's not the problem, right? It's the energeia eis hypostasin. It's the one is the energy, the activity toward the establishment of being. So I'm not, in that sense, I'm not reading energeia into Plotinus' text. That's there. So the question is, it's a more subtle question, which of course we wouldn't be surprised that there are subtleties in Plotinus, right? When you start talking about the one as the act, the cause of the knowing of in another. Okay, I agree. It's a subtle thing, but I think it's fair to say, if you look at the Greek, for those of you who can just pick out the words, reading the clauses backwards, the idea to naein, allo, the cause of to know, the to know in the other, in another, that is noesis, not knowing. In other words, idea is noesis. The cause of the to know in another is the noesis. And what I'm saying is that noesis is an energeia, yes, that it is the actuality of knowing, but what Plotinus is saying is that the one is the actuality of knowing, but it's not the actuality of its own knowing, it's the actuality of of another's to know, okay? Now, we can maybe have a middle ground of understanding here, going back to an analogy that we made in a different context. I think we were pointing out that there's something cosmically superhuman about Plotinus' structure, analogous to the Aristotelian structure of the act of intellection, right? In other words, just as in Aristotle, the act of knowledge, right, is transcendent in our language, transcendent to the reasoning, you see, that it actualizes, so much so that the reasoning doesn't, as it were, immediately experience that act of knowing, that identity of the knower and the known, but the essence for Aristotle becomes therefore always, it has that strange word in it. It's the what is not imperative? What's the other word? What's the middle past? I need a grammarian here. Not the simple past. The was past. What do you call that?
Imperfect.
Imperfect. That's it. Not imperfect. The imperfect tense. Okay. So in other words, Aristotle defines the essence as what it was to be, that thing, you see? Well, who's talking there? I mean, or a better way of putting it, for whom is it that the essence of something is what it was to be? For reason it was to be that. But it's never now for reason that it is the essence of something, you see? Because when reason is the essence, we have the paradoxical situation in which the actualization of the potentiality that reason is beyond itself. See? And that's what I call the paradox in Aristotle. I mean, we may not like it, it's not satisfying, but that's what Aristotle thinks, right? And I'm saying analogously, on a deeper level than might appear, Plotinus also has, it's not a perfect analogy, all analogies limp, but he has an analogous understanding of the relationship between the one and the mind. You see? So another way I could put it is that the nous in Plotinus is analogously, not perfectly, in the place of the reason in Aristotle's soul. You see? And the actualization of its functioning, just as the actualization of the functioning of the rational soul being raised to an act of knowledge, is something beyond it. You see? And to be distinguished from it, even though it's a paradox of some sort, right? How can it be the act of knowing, not of its own knowing, but of the knowing in another? Well, that's at least as paradoxical as Aristotle's psychology, but that's the way it is. I mean, that's the way they understand it. Yes.
It's just there's one of these passages. I think it's the first one that you give extensively.
Okay.
If you read on in Plotinus,
Right.
he goes through this process of saying this is all kind of nonsense because we are at a place where we're literally beyond what language can do.
Right.
We're literally beyond what the intelligence can do.
Right.
Intelligence brings us here, but we really have to leave it behind and take this other step. So I'm just a little nervous about the way in which one then wants to make that towards which it is stepping an actual active intelligence, rather than that it's something more like, I would say the analogy here is either Dante's or Aristotle's unmoved mover. That is, it's the cause of the motion in other. Not that it's the cause of motion in we're not talking about kinesis here, but in terms of action. That it's the one makes the act of intellect possible, but it's not an act itself, except if one's looking at it, allowing a kind of telescoping to take place. So that, well, of course it's the act of intellect because it's doing everything. You can draw it down through the entire process if you line things up the right way.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, I mean,
But it's
look,
just that it's in, you know, I realize in TNO this is not the case, but in Plotinus it is the case that you're dealing with some attempt to align a intellectual process with a contemplative process.
right.
The contemplative process, he gets into his problem is that he's brought the intellectual process all the way up to the acme,
Right.
except for the point.
Okay.
And he's got to make that distinction in order to see.
But to the extent to which he articulates the distinction, he says of the point, noesis. If you want to say
Well, here he
he
does. Yes.
misspoke,
He says what probably are contradictory things, and that's probably impossible not to do.
Okay.
But okay.
Okay. Okay. So over on page 7, for Aristotle, the divine mind, which was the greatest in the genus of immaterial living beings, was the prime unmoved mover, whose life was, the Greek there just says you'll pardon me now, the act of knowing of the act of knowing of the act of knowing. A life which was mind, which was the act of knowing, prehending, grasping itself, an immaterial and therefore eternal contact with itself, which I think we discussed that last time. Plotinus raises noesis above knowing as the cause of the act of knowing in another. The act of knowing, which is the divine mind, is caused by the one which transcends this caused act of divine intellection, as the uncaused God beyond the caused God, as the God beyond the act of knowledge.
Well, that's what this statement seems right to me about Plotinus. Okay, sorry.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I just think there's an irreducible ambiguity in the language, including Plotinus' language.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I draw the analogy, which I've just did here in a different context, a few more lines down on page 7. Pardon me. Maybe altogether about 12 or 13 lines down. The unmoved mover becomes the product of the one and begins to move in the restful motion of the circle. It turns about itself. As the universe is to the unmoved mover in Aristotle, so is the unmoved mover to the one in Plotinus. So that's the same basic analogy I was making before, where I was saying that the active intellect in Aristotle is to reason, as the one is to the nous in Plotinus. And so what I've just said here in the text is the act of the unmoved mover is the universe. So in other words, the point I want to bring together here is that the second half of the analogy is the Plotinian nous is to the one, as reason is to the active intellection in Aristotle's psychology, as the universe, all right, is to the unmoved mover in Aristotle. And I was reminded of that verbally when you were talking about the cause of motion, because if you think about it, this would be another example. I mean, it's not confined to Plotinus. It's another example of the unmoved mover. We're so used to the notion, it seems more familiar to us. But the unmoved mover moves, is the cause of motion. If he were Plotinus, Aristotle would have said, not in himself, but in another, namely the universe. Do you see that? Now, it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question whether or not, I mean, it's clear in Aristotle how he explains that by attraction. Hos eromenon, that the unmoved mover moves the universe without itself moving, not without being the cause of its own motion, as that which is the ideal toward which the universe aspires, namely rest. It's interesting. I don't have the answer offhand whether or not there would be a similar explanation of Plotinus as to the nature of the causality. I was just. You have an opinion on that? I'm suspecting not because of the notion of emanation.
Well, it's because it goes both ways. Emanation goes both ways.
Okay.
There is emanation. What's the term? Epistrophe, and one is return. And there's a whole business about they're really happening in both directions at one time. And I think probably you'd find it in the stuff on beauty.
Okay.
On the aesthetics, because the aesthetics is quite different from Plato, in that it argues that there is beauty in the sensible world, and that the actual projection of the one into its potential world is what is the experience of sensible beauty. So I somehow think that the aristological aspect of it is there in Plotinus, probably taken from Aristotle to resolve that.
Was it Aristotle who first said love makes the world go round?
In effect, I don't think you can find the exact phraseology, but it's true.
Check that out.
Aristotle certainly believes that. Not in the, I don't think in the accepted reading of it in today's world. All right. At the bottom of 7 and over on 8, then is a transition to Augustine. I say at the next to the last line on page 7, for Aristotle, essence, properly speaking, should be said of substance. For Plotinus, essence, properly speaking, should be said of what is not beyond predication. One should not say and think what is otherwise than being and unsayable, which doesn't prevent Plotinus from saying and thinking a lot about it, as we were just noting, and this is also true of Augustine. But for Augustine, essence, properly speaking, should not be said of what is a substance and not beyond predication. And this is a very clear, I mean, in fact, it seems to me, Augustine's point here is not ambiguous, all right? In other words, for Augustine, what is otherwise than being ineffable is that of which essence, properly speaking, should be said. One should say and think what is otherwise than being and unsayable. That is to say, go back to Aristotle, who is most concrete, relatively speaking. You begin to appreciate Aristotle as you go through the history of thought, right? For Aristotle, substance and essence, I guess you could say in the proper sense of the word, although, as I've said, Aristotle uses the word substance in many different contexts. So in certain contexts, matter is the substance of things, depending on what kinds of things we're talking about, and again, the context. But strictly speaking, the essence is the substance of something, right? Ousia and what it was to be, which I think is said in the beginning of this chapter very clearly, they're effectively interchangeable terms. So Augustine's move is quite radical. Now he has the precedent of his Neoplatonic background, right? He does something in a way different, I would say. In fact, I think I'm in effect saying this, that he does something vis-a-vis Plotinus. In Plotinus, there is a kind of, how can I put this? It's a kind, with a grain of salt, take it, a kind of negative theology, a kind of negative spin to the transcendence of the one, whereas in Augustine, it's a positive theology. There's a positive spin to it. What am I talking about, okay? In other words, Augustine has no problem whatsoever distinguishing and elevating the notion of essence and identifying it in a kind of unequivocal way with the Godhead, with the divine being, identifying with that which for him is in the place analogous to the one in Plotinus, all right? So in other words, but when he does that, in a way like Plotinus, all right, so he kind of splits the difference, okay? What I'm saying here in effect is that Plotinus raises the one beyond the level of substance and essence, where substance and essence, as going back to Aristotle, are really not to be distinguished from one another, right? Except in a certain context, a way of speaking, all right? So what I'm saying is that Augustine introduces a diagonal distinction here, right? In other words, yes, God, the Creator, is beyond substance, but he's not, therefore, in Augustine's mind, beyond substance and essence, because Augustine wants to distinguish substance from essence. So God is in essence beyond substance in a way that's new, okay? Now, of course, what it means, and this is important over against Thomas, who comes up in today's reading too, what it means, relatively speaking, anticipating Thomas, right? In doing so, it means, as it were, a kind of, I think I used the phrase in the text here somewhere, a kind of de-essentializing of the world, right? That is, the substantial world, the world created by God. For Augustine, properly speaking, we should not say essence of it, okay? essence, properly speaking, is only to be said of God. Now, you can understand why he's saying that, because in a certain way he's accepting what would be true for Plato and for Aristotle, that essence is, as he, in his language, in today's text, is unchangeable, right? And so at the point in which we'll finally get to it, hopefully in the text, at the point in which he says that essence probably should only be said properly of God, he explains that to mean because only of God can we speak of something that is unchangeable, right? So in other words, whereas there were a multiplicity of essences constituting the Aristotelian universe, none of whom, therefore, by definition, as essences, were changeable. You see, even the essence of natural things, qua essence, did not change. There was no evolution of the species. There was no evolution of essences in Aristotle. You see, even though there was the birth and death of individual instances, individual embodiments of the essence was something eternal. And if the whole world of Aristotle was composed of a kind of hierarchical, more or less, arrangement of essences, maybe that's overstating, but a kind of orderly arrangement of essences, not hierarchical in the sense that we come to an absolute one, as we do in Neoplatonism, but nevertheless an orderly...
It's a taxonomy. There is the beginnings of a taxonomy.
Yeah, a structure. There's a structure.
Some kind of a hierarchy.
Yeah, there's some kind of hierarchy, but it's not absolutely systematic in the later sense of the word. To the extent to which there's multiplicity of essences constituting reality, then, and those essences, not all of them are the essences of natural things, but the essences of natural things are as eternal as the essences that are not essences of natural things, namely the gods, then there is no creation for Aristotle. It just doesn't come up. There is no distinction between essence and existence in the sense that it's going to be the case in Aquinas, in today's reading, where essence is going to be distinguished from existence as potentiality to actuality, where existence, or actually more precisely in Thomas, being, the act of being, transcends, as it were, essentia. Right? It is only in the case of God is there an identification of the two. In everything else, there is a distinction between esse and essentia. Now, I've jumped ahead to Thomas, but I've only done so that I can come back and explain this very important move that Augustine makes. In Augustine, wanting to make a similar distinction between something that is uniquely proper to God, the Creator, right? For Augustine, that's essentia. Well, if essentia is uniquely proper to the Creator, then it's not correct, properly speaking, to speak of creatures as essences. Do you see? So, strictly speaking, properly speaking, they're an essential. When we get to Thomas, he's going to want to make the identical, unique distinction between the Creator and all creatures. He wants to make the same kind of move, right? But instead of identifying the uniqueness of the Creator over against creatures, as the Creator alone should be properly referred to as essence, as something unchangeably eternal. In Thomas, that Creator is going to be, properly speaking, esse, ipsum esse, the act of being itself. And since that is being distinguished in Thomas from essentia in a way which is not the case in Augustine, then Thomas, in effect, it's a little more positive than this, but just stating it minimalistically, has no particular problem. This is a minimalistic statement, doesn't do justice. But then Thomas has no problem, right? Since God's unique, proper being is active being, not really essentia, then Thomas has no problem saying that the creatures are essences, to say that they have an essential being. Now, he will have changed in doing that the meaning of essence, but he will also have raised esse, the act of being, above essence in a way that Augustine doesn't get around to doing. And Thomas will have then, he will have understood something of a kind of transcendent dignity to the creature as such, that I think is is muted in Augustine, is a way of saying it. Now it's hairy, as you'll see when we get a little further into the text. It's another one of these subtle but important distinctions. Substance means to, I guess it means to both Plotinus and Augustine. It implies predication, right? Because it is of substance that things are predicated. The simplicity of God in Augustine is such that there's no distinction, there can be no distinction between subject and predicate. Whatever one might predicate of God, God is that, right? So So in that sense of being beyond predication, God must be beyond the notion of substance. Augustine, in identifying God as beyond substance, nevertheless, and in the classical tradition, in identifying God being beyond substance, because in God there is no division, no distinction that would allow for a predication of a substance, or a substance that might or might not be, or might be accidentally this or that, you see. What Augustine does in denying substance to God is he doesn't want to deny essence to God. Yeah. What I was about to say was traditionally one would have followed upon the other. If God is not a substance, he is not an essence. Okay? So Augustine is saying God is not a substance, but he is an essence. So the question then is, well, why does he do that? In other words, why does he retain the word essence as appropriate to God, as distinguished from substance? To say, and it's because because essence means to Augustine unchangeable. It's the immutability of God, the unchangeableness of God, that allows me to properly speak of him as essence, even though so the flip side of that, all right, is the implication of that, the corollary of that is that for Augustine, substance, which cannot be properly said of God, but which is now being distinguished from essence, substance now takes on the quality which it wouldn't have as long as it had been associated with essence, of changeability. The world is substantial, all right, but that substance is not an eternal essence. Only God is the eternal essence. Yes, there is substance. God has created a substantial world, but the substantial world is inherently changeable, or put it negatively, not immutable. Only God is immutable. 1,000 or more years before we start moving into the modern world, right, where substance is motion, right, where the notion of substance and change and motion are by no means antithetical to one another, right? Well, already in Augustine, that little move he makes there, he's not doing a scientific project, but on behalf of God, he wants to say, yeah, there is substance, all right, but God is not a substance, and the substance there is not to be identified with essence, you see, but because the substance there is has been brought into being by the omnipotent creator, then that substance is inherently changeable. That's it. That's an effective thing.
Right.
There's what he calls inherently changeable. There's a kind of radiant goo that connects to this idea of essence.
Okay.
That there's an element of essence which becomes highly valorized or highly valuable. It's not just its atemporality or changeableness.
Right.
Because what happens in the modern world is that all kinds of rather neutral things become unchangeable, like meanings of words, meanings of propositions. Today, September 20th, 2004 is one day before September 21st, 2004, eternally. It doesn't matter whether we're looking at it last year or today or in some other place. The statement, 2000, so you have rather innocuous and spiritually uninteresting kinds of things that are atemporal.
What's the connection with Augustine?
There's still a kind of unpeeled apartness
Okay.
to what are predicates that in the modern world, once we see how thoroughly mutable substances are,
Right.
we can understand that there was something atemporal about predicates that
Okay.
is not spiritually interesting. And when he's pulling off essence from
Right.
substance, he's got a kind of essence that is spiritually interesting.
Yes. Okay.
And
All right.
that's what I'm saying is
Okay.
that it adheres to the word essence in all kinds of ways throughout history, and probably alchemically, that you're dealing with notions of essences which are they're stuck to God. I mean, the essences
Right.
are they're
Yeah,
not,
well,
they're not
I think there's no
atemporal.
question about it, and it comes up in our friend Peirce, because I think this came up somehow or other recently. In Peirce, there is evolution. Right? Oh, the question had to do with Darwin. What about Darwin? In Peirce, it's not just that there is a biological, natural evolution, but for Peirce, because in Peirce we cannot separate the idea or the eternal reality from the natural world. There's no sharp break in Peirce between any two things. You see? There's a kind of blending, a merging, because the idea, the world of ideal reality, merges, perhaps insensibly, with the natural world. Then what evolution is taking place in the natural world has to also be ascribed for Peirce to the world of ideas. So are there Platonic ideas, says Peirce? Yes, they are. There are. That's right. Except the ideas are evolving. Okay. Well, so what made me think of that is that yes, there's an inextricable intimacy between the notion of God and essence, going back to Aristotle and Augustine and so forth and so on. But sooner or later, right? If essences change, well, I'm not sure which comes sooner or later, right? Because it would depend on how you analyze the history. But certainly, there's an inextricable interrelationship between the coming to be of a notion of an evolving or changing essence or idea, and the notion of an evolving or changing God. Just say. So that's what I would take from your comment.
Yeah.
Okay. In the middle of page 8, I think I'm quoting here. Yeah, well, I'm quoting from in the middle paragraph on page 8. I quote at some length from a passage in Augustine's Predestination of the Saints, and I point out that John Paul in Fides et Ratio referred to this work, and I think he may have referred to the. He did quote part of the section, but I quote at length beyond John Paul because it turns out to be, well, it's very relevant. Of course, he wouldn't have referred to it if it wasn't relevant to his argument, but it's also relevant to understanding what I want to develop in a page or two. And so, quoting from Augustine's Predestination of the Saints on page 8, dropping down about 8 lines or so, 7 or 8 lines into that text, that paragraph. Not that we are sufficient to think anything of ourselves, says Augustine, but quoting Paul, but our sufficiency is of God. Let them give attention to this and well weigh these words, who think that the beginning of faith is of ourselves and the supplement of faith is of God. For who cannot see that thinking is prior to believing? For no one believes anything unless he has first thought that it is to be believed. For however suddenly, however rapidly, some thoughts fly before the will to believe, and this presently follows in such wise as to attend to them, as it were, in closest conjunction, it is yet necessary that everything which is believed should be believed after thought has preceded, although even belief itself is nothing else than to think with assent. For it is not every one who thinks that believes, since many think in order that they may not believe, but everybody who believes thinks, both thinks in believing and believes in thinking. So in other words, the sine qua non for Augustine, which, for example, would be, I guess, heresies, somebody like Schleiermacher, right? The sine qua non of belief is thought, right? There's no such thing as a reduction in Augustine, and it goes back to his Platonism, right? There's no such thing as a reduction of believing to feeling, right? Or what would I think of Feuerbach, right? Belief is just a projection of our feelings, what we would like to be the case. For Augustine, faith and intellect, and this is why John Paul quotes it, because John Paul wants to say that the impact of Christianity on civilization was not simply to put, I don't think he uses the metaphor, but he might have. It wasn't a question of pouring new wine into old bottles, right? That's Jesus' metaphor. It wasn't taking the content of faith and pouring it into the classical mindset, you say. It's new wineskins, new bottles, right? In other words, that the pouring in of the faith into Western consciousness, in the language of the thinking now occurring, transformed it. In fact, I think that in rereading this, I mentioned to you this one general reservation I have about John Paul as a thinker, not as a pope now, but as a thinker, and that is that he is a believing form, but nevertheless an extenuated form of a modern thinker. And maybe this is the point of difference. If you read carefully the citations that come up, I think, in today's reading from John Paul, he wants to say, in effect, that faith, how's the word? Unbridled, it liberated, it. In fact, I think he uses the word.
Yes.
It brought out what was implicit in ancient thought. Okay. And by the way, I have to, to be fair to John Paul, he has very good authority for looking at it that way, because that's basically the way Thomas proceeds, right? I don't think Thomas makes a case like that, but that's the way he thinks. In other words, Thomas will quote Aristotle as the authority on everything, including God, up to the point, right, where by faith he can go beyond him, okay? So implicit in Thomas's reading of Aristotle is that Aristotle was on the right track. And although he didn't say what I'm now going to tell you is the ultimate implication of divine being, nevertheless, it's implicit in Thomas's mind, right? Faith makes it explicitly. Right? That's basically Thomas's way of looking at it, and John Paul is echoing Thomas in that respect. So what I was starting to say, well, what's the difference between the thinking now occurring? In other words, there's a point of contact there with John Paul too. Right? If you're going to have one with Plotinus, you're going to have one with Nietzsche. I mean, you got to have one with John Paul too, right? So, what's the point of contact? The point of contact is that there is a constructive, changing relationship. You see, impact, if you want, of faith on consciousness and on thought. But the thinking now occurring is more. Again, I use a word which I don't like. Radical in the sense that it wants to say it didn't simply make explicit what was implicit, but it has actually, in the course of time, it has actually transformed, it has actually changed, right? Reason. It has, to use a way of speaking it's a little stilted, but it's precise. The thinking now occurring understands that faith and the incarnation have novated reason, not simply unshackled it, but changed it. The world is being transformed all the way down, so to speak. So I think there is that difference, despite the points of contact. In any event, to go back to Augustine. And so why Augustine is quoted by quoted by John Paul, and why it's important to the thinking now occurring to bring this thought of Augustine's into play, is that for Augustine, faith and thought are inseparable, and what in my language, the sine qua non, the condition without which there is no faith, is thinking. Now, it doesn't follow automatically, as he just said, that if I think, I'm going to believe, because some people think in order not to believe, right? But if I'm going to believe, I first have to think. I first have to have proposed to my mind, in other words, some object to which I'm going to assent, in the language of Augustine. All right, so he says in the bottom, in the bottom paragraph on 8, what Augustine says is that thinking is necessary to faith.
Before you get there, man.
Okay.
Essentially, to try to square this with what Descartes says, Augustine says that I think, therefore I can believe. I may not believe, therefore I think.
Yeah, all right.
Is that right?
Yeah, you could say something. I think, therefore
I think, therefore I
yeah, of course, there's no immediacy to that. I mean, when Descartes says, I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
It's not, I think, therefore I can be. He has no choice
No, I understand.
qua thinker to be.
I understand,
Okay.
yeah.
But the,
But to the extent that Descartes derives from Augustine, is it in terms of this statement here that in other words the idea that thinking is central to one's essence or existence, that seems to be in everything I've read in this book a novation. In other words, the idea that just the act of thinking either creates an immediacy of existence, my own existence, or a capacity to believe or not believe. Thinking is central here. It's central to both
I think that,
Augustine and to
yeah, I think you're onto something. In other words, and it may go a little further than that too, because you'll notice that Descartes, and this is going to come up at the tail end of today's assignment if we can get there, that Descartes, cogito ergo sum, he gives a kind of primacy to thinking, and also ontologically does so because he immediately concludes, as it were, that the thinking thing that he is it, whether or not he has a body, or whether or not there is a world, right? So his thinking, the thinking thing is a thing thinking independently, you see, and this is the anti-Aristotelian move of Descartes, independently of his experience. He thinks his thinking does not begin in experience, and it certainly doesn't end as it does in Thomas in experience. And in Augustine, there is something of that because I don't think we've quite gotten to it, but I've alluded to it when Augustine talks about the necessity of the mind to withdraw itself, which is brought up at the beginning of the next chapter by way of introduction to Descartes, withdraw itself from things in order to grasp itself. To say, what he's saying is Cartesian, or what Descartes is saying is Augustinian, that somehow the mind exists, even though de facto it has confused itself and grown together with in its own thought things outside of itself, things external to it. It is properly speaking independently of those things. Yes. So in that sense, thinking is not only central, but in some sense, both in Augustine and in Descartes, in importantly different ways, but nevertheless the point of agreement would be, that the thinking soul is such in a way that it is independent of sensible experience. And that's something, generally speaking, of a kind of Platonic bias, and maybe even a Plotinian bias, since the latter is also a Platonic thinker, right? Yes.
A person who ends up not believing isn't necessarily thinking in order not to believe. Certainly in the quasi-modern world, in modern world, people do a lot of thinking without the idea that they have the purpose not to believe. So that kind of thinking is also different from gracious thinking. The thinking that is tinged by grace is different also, not only from the willful I won't believe thinking, but also from the kind of thinking that is simply a genuine inquiry. Because the genuine inquiry is different from a genuine inquiry, which is in fact grace.
Okay. The only thing I could say is that he just doesn't cover that one here.
Yeah.
But in defense of Augustine, his whole first 33 years of his life
was that first kind of thing.
Was in search of the truth. Yeah. So I don't think he would rule it out, right? But he would say, as you point, that thinking will not of itself lead to faith, right? Because he says in the bottom of that middle paragraph on page 8, so no one is sufficient for himself, either to begin or to perfect faith.
Yes, right. Okay. So, but the important thing is that faith is irrevocably bound to believe.
You mean that?
That's what
You
he's saying.
said faith is irrevocably bound to belief.
Yes. That's what
Do-
Augustine
belief?
is saying.
Do you mean thought?
No, belief. That
Well,
belief. in
what
other words,
distinction are you
there-
making?
Well, that there could be a kind of faith which is other than whether or not one believes something. One can be committed to a kind of spiritual connection to a tradition or to a vision or to an orientation which is other than the assent of natural reason.
Oh, okay. So you're using well,
Like
right,
modernity.
huh?
Well, some
Like
in
modernity.
modernity, some
All right,
aspects of modernity.
but
sure.
semantic problem. You said faith is
Irrevocably bound to belief.
to belief,
Because it's
but you're
belief
using
that's-
belief in the sense in which an American would, meaning thought.
Well, the way this would, the way Augustine
Okay.
would, yeah.
All right.
So, but that
Okay.
makes that I'm just saying that this difference of thought
Right.
is other than the difference between faith and belief, because the faith is a transformation of the thought such that thought becomes belief.
Okay.
It's
I
like,
don't
for instance,
find in I don't
It would be radically
I don't
different
find
from,
in
from
Augustine's
anything
text.
that it would be different from anything that you could find in a Kierkegaardian universe in which
Well, I
faith
agree
is
with that.
other than
That's
belief.
That's right. But I think, as far as Augustine's text goes, the distinction between faith and belief, I don't think he makes that
No,
distinction.
I know. That's what I'm saying. I'm sort of tracing, in my mind, I'm tracing
Okay.
a history of the relationship between spiritual orientation and thought.
Okay.
Which is one
All
of-
right.
you know-
But in Augustine's language, as we have it
No, of
in
course.
his text,
Yeah.
the issue is faith and thought.
Yeah.
And therefore, I would say, in Augustine's language, there is no faith
Other
that
than
is,
belief.
that is not inextricably bound up with thinking. You said belief again, but in Augustine's text, it's thinking.
Well, but faith and belief are the same thing. That's all. There is no. He's done making a distinction between faith and belief. There's no distinction in Augustine between
Faith and belief, that's
Yeah,
correct.
Okay, that's all.
Okay. So I say, on page 8 of the bottom paragraph, what Augustine says is that thinking is necessary to faith, but God is necessary to thinking. Therefore, God is necessary to faith precisely through the middle term, thinking. If some think so as not to believe, skipping the parenthesis, second line from the bottom, the difference of the thinking of faith, for which God is the sufficiency, will necessarily be that of a thinking somehow or other adapted to faith. If faith is the matter of thought, thought is materially affected by faith. Faith and the God who has provided faith with thinking as its necessary presupposition will be for Augustine the presupposition for all true thinking about God. God is the sufficiency of a faithful thinking of the matter of faith, or in the form of the proportionate truth that it is, God is to thinking as the sufficiency of thinking. God is to thinking as thinking is to faith. In other words, I can't think without God, and I can't have faith without thinking, right? So God is to thinking as thinking is to faith. Now, I think you've caught me doing this before, but I want to make very explicit. I take very seriously this notion of proportionality, not just with numbers, but also with concepts, right? So this is a proportion that, in effect, Augustine sets up. Now, I don't think he would prove it the way I'm going to do here, right? But I think in proving it, it brings out, it makes explicit some things that are implicit in Augustine's text.
He wouldn't call this a proof either, would he?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't think he would make the move that I'm about to make here. That's right. Well, if you're going to, it is a proof. It's a linguistic form of the thing called 2 is to 4 is 4 is to 8. The proof of which is to multiply the extremes by the means, divide one by the latter, and if in ordinary mathematics, if you get 1, you've proven the proportion.
Yeah,
If
but
you
the
get
difference is that 2 is to 4 as 4 is to 8 is.
Yeah, it's true.
The difference between that and what you got here is that
this is even more
this
is.
an arbitrary
This is as
positive.
is as you can get.
Well, you
No, there's nothing arbitrary about it.
Well,
Right.
it's arbitrary to take that particular form as a form of proof. One day you'll explain to us why.
Well, I
why
only
you
mean by
like it.
proof. I think you're putting.
What
putting
you
the
mean by
wrong-
proof?
I don't mean
It's a personal point, is that what you're saying?
No, a person.
Person.
Oh,
Person.
on there.
Yeah. No, the proof here is it's not a proof of persuasion. It's in the
form.
technical mathematical sense. It's just that it works. It fits. It proves itself out. it's not a proof in a rhetorical sense. I think the other thing.
No, I wasn't talking.
Okay. All right. So yes, the point here. This is not a rhetorical use of the word proof. Right? It's just to say that if Augustine in fact sets up this proportion, that much he does. Whether he calls attention to it as such, I'm willing to take the blame for that. So God is the thinking is the faith. The proof in the technical, non-rhetorical sense, of which proportion is, multiplying the extremes, the identification of God with faith. All right? So in other words, just go up one line. God is the thinking is the faith. If God and faith in that were, let's say, 2 and 8, 2 times 8 is 16. So I'm doing something very technical here, which I do all the time, but I'm just calling it to your attention so that you can object. The identification of God and faith is like identifying the 2 and the 8 in the mathematical proportion. So multiplying 2 times 8, I want to use a Baduidian term there, in a kind of meta-ontological way. The meta-ontological equivalent of multiplication is identification. Okay, that's the idea. So if I 2 times 8 meta-ontologically is identifying 2 with 8. When I identify 2 with 8, I get 16. Right? That's it. Right? So analogously, the identification of God with faith, right, that would be the extremes, the multiplication of the extremes, is a different thinking. What is a different thinking? The proportion. God is to thinking as to faith. I have 2 is to 4 is 4. Well, 2 is to 4 as 4 is to 8. 2 times 8 is 16. 4 times 4 is 16. But another way of doing it is 4 squared in this case, right, is 16. Right? So when I use the word different in these contexts, right, whenever I'm doing one of these proportions, and you're trying to sort out where did this come from, this notion, a different thinking, it's actual thinking. So go back to the seminar, the ethics seminar, when you look at that index of the ethic of simplicity, and you say in dimension 1, readiness has the logical digit associated with it of 0, but in trinary logic now, not in ordinary binary trinary logic, but in real trinary logic, 0, 0 equals 1. Right? So in other words, the squaring, as it were, the multiplication of 0 by itself, right, equals 1. All right? And so I could also say actual readiness, you see, equals, in this case, would be doing the right thing. Right? So in other words, so squaring, and this works not. This is not a complete invention, right? As I think I pointed out to you, an actual coupling is always going to take a square form. It's not going to be j. It's going to be j squared, right? So there's something inherent in the notion of the squaring, the immediate identification of something with itself, right? Has to do with existence, actuality, and in the thinking now occurring, has to do with difference, right? So these are all different ways of connoting what is implied by squaring the means of a proportion such as 2 is to 4 is 4 is to 8. In this case, squaring thinking as the means is actual thinking, and actual thinking, and you can see how deeply true this is in the thinking now occurring, actual thinking in the thinking now occurring is always different thinking. I could easily say that if you square something, you've got the new something, right? Anything that's actual is new, is different. If it's existing, it's new, it's different. Right? That's the thinking now occurring in a nutshell. Okay, so squaring thinking in this Augustinian proportion is a different thinking, but it's a new thinking, and it is. Damn it, it is a new thinking. Just check your textbook in the history of philosophy. Okay, so Augustine is into a new thinking. I want to say he's into a. Now I don't say it here, but I will say it in the appendix when I zero in on this in a slightly different context. He's into a new thinking. It's here in this text, but it's not chiseled out as it is in the appendix. What constitutes the newness of Augustine's thinking is its matter, right? so let me, in fact, it does come up here. God is the sufficiency of a faithful thinking of the matter of faith, or in the form of the proportionate truth that it is. God is to thinking as to faith. The proof of which proportion is the identification of God with faith is a different thinking. Transposing the underlying terms of proportion, God is to the necessity that faith be a matter of thought, as the necessity that God be thought sufficiency is to faith. And so I've transposed the terms to create an alternative proportion that effectively says the same thing with a different slant. And then the proof of that, non-rhetorical proof, is the identification of God with faith is the identification of the necessity that faith be a matter of thought with the necessity that God be thought's sufficiency. How is it at all possible to say and think what is beyond being and nothing and beyond predication? There is a different thinking. All right, so the basic answer to that is that the thinking that is a faithful thinking, that is produced by the proving of this proportion, or that it is made explicit, highlighted by the proving of the proportion, it's that different thinking that is able for Augustine to say and think what is otherwise, we might say, beyond predication. The difference is God's sufficiency to thought identified with faith as a matter of thought. If you read, for example, if you read the Trinity, from which I'm quoting generous portions in this book, and if you read most of what Augustine writes, but in the Trinity it's very clear, very explicit, because he's got an explicitly intellectual problem. His problem in the Trinity is not converting the barbarians or anything like that, or defending against heresy. He's trying to understand the Trinity. He believes in the Trinity by faith, but he's not satisfied to believe it, because he's already told us, that you can't separate faith from thought, no matter which way you're running. So he wants to understand what he believes, and so but he's explicit in the Trinity that the condition for understanding what he believes is faith, right? In other words, so therefore, in turn, he's dependent upon God the grace of God, in order to assist him in his understanding. So, yeah.
It seems like what you've just described is the opposite direction of what he has said.
Which is?
His said is, when the preacher speaks, some people believe and some people don't.
Correct.
So he believes, but the thinking that he's doing is subsequent to that belief. So where does that thinking that he's doing in the De Trinitate, where does that fit into his understanding of thinking? Since it's neither the thinking that leads to belief, tinged by grace, nor any of the other forms of thinking that you could think of.
Well, in the passage you just alluded to, which is quoted further down on page 9, Predestination 15, quote, "When therefore the gospel is preached, some believe not. But they who believe at the voice of the preacher from without hear of the Father from within and learn, while they who do not believe hear outwardly, but inwardly do not hear nor learn."
Right. Now, this is the point, that this hearing inwardly,
right,
is something other than the kind of ratiocination that he's involved in this problem that he has in writing this book. That inward hearing is a kind of something that has some kind of relationship to belief for sure, but it's other than the reasoning that he's doing in doing his hermeneutic to develop what it means rationally that there could be the Trinity.
Okay, but there's not a discontinuity in his mind. In other words, if
but it's
the one who has faith has it because the Father gives that faith internally, and he hears the word and he learns, then he comes to know something.
Yes, but it's just that I'm sorry that this is important to me.
Okay.
That the understanding of what thinking is substantially,
right?
What it really is. That's an important thing for us.
Okay.
That thinking not be understood as simply the ex post facto elaboration of a hermeneutic system. That thinking is somehow understood. The difference in thinking is precisely that inward hearing, that through which one comes to learn. That's something different than this elaborating of a rational system.
Well, okay, but I don't think that his work on the Trinity is the elaboration of a rational system. It's an attempt to understand.
To unpack, say, something. I mean, it's something different from what happened to him. It's different from the event which made...
But it's a continuation of the event, I'm sure. In other words, his faith is his starting place and gives him the confidence to believe that with God's help, he can have a better, fuller, more complete understanding of what he believes.
But that initial event, the incursion, the event which I would, the word that's available would be a certain kind of intuition.
Well, it's grace.
But there are all kinds of grace, right? The grace doesn't only have to do with the establishment of a belief in an intellectual who's been looking for truth for 30 years. It strikes people in all kinds of ways.
Okay.
So there's some distinction between this kind of grace and grace.
Well, in Augustine's case, it was God gave him the grace to hear and learn the truth.
Okay.
Right, and he pursued it. He wanted to know more about it. But in other words, for him, faith is a grace given to him by God. For him.
Sure.
Okay.
Can I
Okay.
raise what I think is a very fundamental problem with this? This proof that you offer here reminds me of or it smacks of some kind of Cartesian elimination of a middle term. I mean, one of the things you say about Descartes later on is that, I can't quote it exactly, but that he sort of starts from nowhere.
No minor premise.
Yeah, no minor premise, right?
No major premise.
No major
sorry,
premise. Right, sorry.
So now, in Foundation, which I just happen to have with me, whatever one might think of the craziness of it, at least it has this, I know you don't like the term Kabbalistic, but you have this middle term, if you will, you taking biblical statements or whatever, converting them into rational functions, through the use of the device that the Hebrew and the Greek, to some extent, I gather, are not just letters but numbers, right? So you can convert a statement. So in some sense, the math becomes your middle term. But it seems to me that here what you're doing is skipping that entirely and just, rearranging these thoughts without any, to me, rational basis for doing so. At least in the case of the math that you got in Foundation, there is that sort of comfort, if you will. Here, you simply posit it. You say it's non-rhetorical. I don't think it's convincing on any level. I mean, but I think you defend what's in here as not being arbitrary, in part because there is a structure to it. Here, in this one paragraph on page 9, what are we supposed to do? Take this on faith?
Well, what are you having trouble taking on faith?
That these proportions somehow or other have some grounding that historically or otherwise we can, glom onto or whatever the operative predicate is.
I don't see the problem. In other words, if
anybody see the problem?
let me
I
explain.
don't think it's supposed to convince of anything. It just is what it is.
I see.
I think if
Okay.
you just did a loop around the proportions, the argument still goes.
Well, it is what it is. I mean, it says what it says. It's a proportion.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna write a book
the
saying
key,
just the opposite.
No. The difference would be, this would be groundless
Yeah.
if the base proportion was not clearly in Augustine's text. Right? In other words, I'm not creating the proportion between God and thinking and faith. I am not saying that God is to thinking as thinking is to faith.
No,
Augustine says that. He
No, I
says
know,
that,
you take it one step,
I just say
further.
You
that's,
just say it's a new thinking and it's.
no, I just say
This is not Augustinian, this is Leahy here.
what is August? No, wait, no. Yes, I am. The Augustinian part. This is important. The Augustinian part, which he spent this whole paragraph on the previous page driving home, is that, putting it simply on page 9, but we can put it more complexly. In fact, I do in that paragraph. God is to thinking as thinking is to faith. That is to say, run it backwards. Without God, there's no thinking, and without thinking, there is no faith. That's his proportion. He may not set it up in a one-liner, but that's the proportion that he, in effect, makes very, very clear in his text. That's key. That's fundamental. Since that proportion is there, all I've done is highlight it, abstract it if you want, and examine it. If that's the proportion that he's working with, that God is the thinking is the faith, well, what are the implications of that proportion? Well, how do you find out what the implications of a proportion are? You play with it. You multiply the extremes by each other, and then multiply the means, you divide it, and you see what happens. That's all proof means here. You take the elements in a certain order, which is thoroughly Augustinian, and then you examine those elements in that order, what the implications are, what further relationships can I bring out of the initial set of relationships. And that's what mathematics is all about. That's what thinking is all about, is what I'm saying. So if you say that this is groundless, then you're not prepared to think. That's what thinking is.
Well,
It's not a matter of persuasion. It's not a matter of convincing. That's true. And in that sense, it is what it is. But it's not arbitrary. It's
certainly
a
more
matter of
confusing.
thinking. Huh? Well, it could be.
Well, the identification of God with faith is the identification of the necessity that faith would be a matter of thought with the necessity that God be thought sufficiency.
Right.
I don't see that kind of rhetoric or logic in what's quoted on the previous page from Augustine. What Augustine lays out is fairly conventional. The new thinking complicates the statement, identifies various concepts with other concepts that are not identified in the text.
The difference is, you say complicates it, but if you buy the premise that the basic proportion is exactly what is being explicated in what you're calling a conventional way by Augustine, that God is the thinking is the faith, if that's the whole point of his text, what you're calling complicating it can be explained this way, that Augustine is not writing a history of thought. He's not writing a history of consciousness. So of course, this is, if you want, a second or third level of analysis of his text, which is only appropriate to somebody living in the third millennium who's looking back on Augustine's text and saying, well, what are some of the implications? What can I see in this proportion that he's dealing with straightforwardly and conventionally? What are some of the unstated implications of that proportion, which he did not make explicit? You're right, he did not make it, because to make those things explicit, he would have been writing a different treatise.
Yeah. Well, when you say proportion,
right,
this is historically you are invoking mathematics.
Yes, but
right?
Mathematics predates
Right.
Augustine.
But what you're doing now is prescinding from the mathematics that you dedicated half this book to, and now you're in a sense transcending mathematics, right?
No.
And making what is historically a mathematical function a function of the word.
Correct. And if you read Foundation carefully, you will note the fundamental notion leading up to all the mathematics, which otherwise you now find persuasive. Conveniently now.
I say it's more persuasive than this.
It's always
Doesn't
the
mean
case.
it's persuasive.
The last book always
problem.
rises in intelligibility compared to the present text.
There's a kind of-
But anyway, let me make the point. But that book, Foundation, one of the most fundamental points that made in it is the identification of quality and quantum of language and number. All right. So there's nothing new here. Right. This is just a working out, an implementation of the fundamental notion of that book is that to count and to tell are identical.
Can I?
Yeah.
Actually, I have a similar problem to yours, but it isn't quite as strong. It's just an inquiry to me. So I don't really have a feel for what the great attraction is to proportionality. Okay, now wait, don't answer that quite yet. Because
You
what
want to talk about heresies?
Yeah. What's going on here is you've taken the Augustinian material and you've put it in the form of proportionality,
True.
which you can say, okay, that's a little engine for generating some other thoughts, that's well good. I'm all for engines that generate other thoughts. But what I'd like to do is look at the actual proportion and try to unpack it and see what it's saying qua proportion. What does it mean to say God is to thinking, as thinking is to faith? Not by running through the algorithm of putting the extremes and the means in multiplication, but just looking at what is that saying.
Well, you could do that.
Okay,
But then you would have to write your own book.
well, all right, but that's where I get stuck, is that I feel I'm being drawn into a kind of thinking that's not what I would have to do in order to follow what you're saying. I need to say, what does it mean to say God is to thinking, as thinking is to thought? Well, you've said a lot of things about the relationship between God as to thinking. You've said that God must be must adapt thinking to faith in order for the thinking to create belief. Okay, that's God is to thinking. Now, how is that thinking is to faith? Thinking isn't adapting faith to something, so I'm just not getting the actual sense of the proportion.
Well, the actual sense of the proportion is very straightforward from Augustine. It has to do with the condition. The condition of our thinking is God. God is the sufficiency of our thinking, from Paul, and the condition for faith is thinking. So in other words, without God there's no thinking, without thinking there's no faith. That's a simple, straightforward thrust of Augustine's text.
Hey, wait. God is the condition for thinking, parentheses, were thinking to be faithful.
No, I don't think he's saying that. God is the
Because the other
sufficiency
kind
of our thinking.
But the
period.
other kind of thinking, there is another kind of thinking that's not sufficient
Yeah,
for faith.
right.
That's the thinking that in order not to believe.
Right.
All right. So God is conditional to that thinking too.
I think so. I think that's true. In other words, all thinking, God is, I don't think there's any qualification.
Then what's the in order there? What's the meaning of in order? In order sort of implies that's what I was saying before, that in order says that I somehow have control of my thinking if it's not faithful thinking. I
Okay.
can think in order to not have faith.
But you can't.
But I
You
can't
cannot
think-
depart from God unless He. You're not sufficient of your own.
Well, okay, but we're sort of outside of that. We're talking about different kinds of thinking. So God is to thinking, in the sense, is something other than the question of God is thinking in relationship to faith. God is the condition of all thought.
Right.
Okay, then.
And the condition of all faith is
Okay,
thought.
and then thinking is the condition of all faith.
Correct.
Okay, all right, now I understand.
All right.
What?
Right, well, now we've unpacked it. I mean, somehow.
I wouldn't say that.
Okay. I just want to call attention to his distinction there on page 9, about 2/3 of the way down, that the Son of Man on account of the man taken up, and the Son of that Christ is called Son of Man and Son of God. Son of Man on account of the man taken up, and Son of God on account of the God only begotten who took him up, so that a Trinity and not a quaternity might be believed in. I just wanted to say what that's referring to, right? In other words, the one person is both Son of Man and Son of God. If, in other words, the incarnation does not imply two persons, then we would have the three persons of the Godhead, and we'd have a fourth. We'd have a quaternity, right? So in other words, there's only one person involved in the incarnation, which is an important issue, but I don't want to dwell on it. I just want to comment on that particular usage. All right, at the bottom of page 9, third line up, Then in Augustine, the different thought is that this transcendent one or good, this God beyond the created God and gods, without ceasing to be beyond contact with itself, is not beyond contact with the human in the person of the Word. All right? So running through this analysis is the notion that the Plotinian one is beyond the Aristotelian notion of the divine being in contact with itself. And so the uncreated God in Plotinus could not be said to be in contact with itself. It could hardly be said to be in contact with anything, okay? But it certainly can't be said to be in contact with itself. And that much appears in Augustine, right? But in Augustine, that Godhead that is not in contact with itself is the Trinity, right? So it's got a if I want a better term, it's got a specification, it's got a contact that of course it would not have in Plotinus. But there is a contact moment in Augustine that pertains to that Trinity, that creator, and the contact moment is the incarnation, right? So when the Word assumes human flesh, when it assumes humanity, right? It doesn't assume a person, remember, we just said that, no Trinity. It assumes the human nature, it assumes and in assuming, I'm saying it is in contact with the human in the person of the Word. The unmade maker of all that is made is not the active knowledge of another who is qua another divine intellect, as in Plotinus, but the unmade maker of Augustine is the active knowledge of another who is qua another, the man Jesus Christ. All right? So the Godhead, insofar as there are not two persons, we have in the incarnate Word, we have, I guess traditionally it would have been called a mystery. We certainly have a paradox, we certainly have a problem, an intellectual problem analogous to the Plotinian problem of how the one can be the act of knowing that is not its own to know, you see, the noesis of the na'in allo, another's to know, you see. Analogously, I'm saying in the incarnate Word, there is the act of the knowing of another qua human. You see? Not another God, all right? But another human, the one person, that one human person who is knowing, humanly speaking, right? The actuality, to go back to the energeia idea, the actuality of that knowing is the actuality of the divine person, right? So the divine person is the actuality of its knowing qua human. Might be, I think, a fairly direct and simple way of putting that. Okay. And then I quote the passage which I've alluded to, but I'm not going to read through it because I've already drawn the distinction, I think, from the thinking now occurring from John Paul, the notion of what I would call the constructive impact of the fathers upon reason, not simply pouring, in my language, new wine into old bottles, but really expanding and liberating, as it were, those bottles to beat the analogy to death. All right. Now I'm going to skip over at the bottom of 10 and top of 11. He touches on the linguistic translation problem of the labeling of the three persons of the Trinity, but he does come back to that on page 12, so we don't have to read that issue twice. All right, and at the risk of creating a riot, I'm going to point out on page 11 another proportion that the thinking now occurring is able to see in the Augustinian text, right? That whether it's spelled out there, it's there in substance, and having seen that proportion, draws out its implications in the second paragraph on page 11. Again, qua proportion, the being of God is to the thought of God, as the thought of God is to the speaking of God. Rendered otherwise, this proportion is God's being with itself without contact, which, if you want a shorthand for that, God's being with itself without contact, would be the Trinity, is to God's being in contact with mankind, shorthand the incarnation, as God's being in contact with mankind, the incarnation, is to God's being the person of the incarnate Word, the proof of which proportion is, in the first instance, the speaking of God identical with the being of God, is the transcendent thought of God, or in the second instance, the being of God with itself, without contact, identical with God's being the person of the incarnate Word, is God actually in contact with mankind. So,
Well, that's perfectly clear.
good. But I'm going to, I know you've got it, but I want to, for the sake of others, say a couple of comments on that, all right? Again, speaking of the middle, right? In other words, the last part of this last sentence that I just read, God actually in contact with mankind is the proof form of the means. It's the God in contact with mankind, the incarnation squared. That is the actual incarnation, the incarnation qua existent, and I could say in thinking now in current terms, qua existence. Do you see? So that actual incarnation, that incarnation qua existence, that is identically the how shall I say, the identification of the Trinity and the person of the incarnate Word. So I try and summarize this as we go through here. The mean proportional between the Trinity and the incarnation is the actual contact of the divine with mankind, or the transcendent thought of God. Now that, especially in light of everything we've been doing in, most recently, I guess, in Foundation, because I think Husserl, no, he comes up in Novitatis Mundi. That's a very pregnant statement there. The transcendent thought of God is thought of God squared, right? Or actual thought of God. That's another one I could have added to the list. Different, existent, actual, transcendent, because in a phenomenological context, the transcendent world is the world of existence. It's precisely the transcendent world, the existent world qua existence, that Husserl brackets when he does his famous phenomenological epoche, right? Okay, so we know in the context of 20th century thought, when we're talking about transcendence, we're not talking about some other world. We're talking precisely about the world qua existence. You see? So the thought of God qua existent, transcendent, qua actual, right? That is the middle term here. It may be noted that this mean proportional, the actual contact of God with man, or God as the act of thought. Another way of phrasing the same thing, all right? The transcendent thought of God, God as the act of thought. In other words, God, the thought of God as existent equals is God as the act of thought. Right? Now, but the act of thought, what does that mean? It doesn't mean in some free-floating sense, right? It means first and foremost as the act of thought of the person who is the incarnate Word. Okay, and then I say it may be noted that this mean proportional, or God as the act of thought, is what revelation is. All right. So I mean, we have a kind of you talk about all different kinds of meanings of belief and faith and so on. You know, what is revelation? Depends on who you ask. Okay, so here is a very precise definition of revelation, right? Revelation in the certainly in the Augustinian sense, what I'm saying, drawing it out of his text, right? Revelation is the act of thought that God is in the person of the Word. That's what revelation is, right? Then the following critical distinction, otherwise found in Augustine's The Trinity, is immediately intelligible in terms of this proportion. Even though he didn't make the proportion, fundamental to his analysis, Augustine's analysis, is the distinction he makes between what he calls the eternal mission of the Son, mission here meaning literally in the Latin, the sending, right? The Son is on a mission. Well, he's sent by the Father eternally, and he is sent temporally, right? That's an Augustinian distinction. That's fundamental. What I'm saying is that if I create this proportion of other fundamental notions of Augustine, then I can understand logically, right, the relationship between the eternal sending of the Son and the temporal sending of the Son, because the middle term, so to speak, between them is the transcendent thought of God, is the actual thought of God. The middle term between those two is revelation, right? So revelation then is a radically historical. I mean, this is not, the text is not about this, but I'm drawing out, now I'm compounding the complexity, all right? I'm commenting on the complication of Augustine's text to draw out the larger point that revelation is absolutely historically grounded in the person of the incarnate Word. Does it say that? That's what, there is no other revelation. See, that would be the point. Certainly in this sense, we could say with a capital R. And this becomes important, by the way, when we get to Levinas. Because Levinas is going to backtrack, having been some kind of a Heideggerian, he's going to backtrack into that pre-original world, right? That immemorial state, in which I'm going to point out that he doesn't altogether abandon the notion of revelation or the incarnation, you say, but he eternalizes it. Right? He makes it a condition. And not a radically historical event, as it is certainly for Augustine.
Now, what's the relationship of that sense of revelation and the sense of the grace sufficient to the thought that is believed? This is the same.
Well,
that's the same thing in some sense. That it's the.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Right. To receive the revelation.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Over on page 12, which I had alluded to before, he picks up the same little problem that he has, which is something of a technical problem. Back on page 10, is how to articulate the faith that the one God is three persons. He says there about 7 or 8 lines down. Again, it could not say that they were not three somewhats, tria quidam, for it was because Sibelius said this that he fell into heresy. For it must be devoutly believed, as most certainly known from the scriptures, and must be grasped by the mental eye. Notice again how important it is to Augustine to grasp with the mental eye this, what otherwise is often passes for unintelligible mystery. You say, no. You have to have some understanding of this, with undoubting perception even. Okay. Notice, by the way, that undoubted. You wonder, speaking of Descartes, right? Descartes starts with doubt, and I told you in another context he has an immediate setup for that in Thomas's notion that the defective human intellect, its foundations are like quicksand, right? He doesn't use that metaphor, but is everything that the human mind thinks is subject to doubt. Okay, but certainty and doubt certainly already are issues here for Augustine, right? Because if you're proposing that the one is three and the three is one, then in your everyday world, you're going to encounter a lot of skepticism, a lot of doubt about that, right? So he's saying not only is this something that is not to be doubted, but it is something to be perceived with the mind in an undoubting way. That there is both Father and Son and Holy Spirit, and that the Son is not the same with the Father, nor the Holy Spirit the same with the Father or Son. It sought then by what three it should call them, and answered substances or persons, by which names it did not intend diversity to be meant, but singleness to be denied. But what he means there is it didn't imply that there was a diversity of gods, right? But that the one God was not single right? That has to be denied. There's some kind of differentiation here. Now he's at great pains to figure out, well, what kind is it? And he ultimately comes to the conclusion, following down in this paragraph, that the difference between the persons is a matter of relation. That the persons, if we're going to try, now you have to understand, he has got in his mind, from time immemorial, philosophically, he's got in his mind the Aristotelian categories. And we've talked about substance, and we've had occasion to talk about quality and quantity. One of the Aristotelian categories, fundamental categories, is relation, right? So he's thinking as a thinker here, right? In other words, we can't call these, even though the Greeks, because they use the word substance differently than what we do here in the West, right? Even though we can't translate easily Greek into Latin, we know what they're talking about, and we know what we're talking about, and so somebody, I think it was Tertullian actually, here in the West came up with the notion of using the word person. Augustine is ultimately going to settle on the word person to speak of the three somethings, somewhats, that constitute the lack of singleness in the Trinity, right? But categorically, qua thinker, he's going to put these persons, these three somewhats, these three difference ts in the one God. He's going to put them in the category not of substance, because then we'd have three different beings, right? We're going to put them in the category of relation. So within the one essence that is the divine being, there is a trinity of relations. That's his ultimate solution to the problem. Okay, so he says, toward the bottom of that paragraph on page 12, speaking of God, therefore he subsists relatively as he begets relatively, that is, the Father begets the Son. The Father's relationship to the Son is one of is just that. The Father is to the Son as a relationship within the Godhead. It's a relation, and he bears the rule. God is related to the world, right? Bears the rule relatively. So then substance will no longer be substance because it will be relative. For as from being he is called essence, so from subsisting we speak of substance. But it is absurd that substance should be spoken relatively, for everything subsists in respect to itself, how much more God. The term substance, I say, substance here is the Greek hypostasis, which is very close literally to the English Latin substantia, right? Basically it's a Latinate version, but it has different connotations in Latin. You see, that's the point. So the term hypostasis is, if distinguished from the one essence of God, is improperly employed to denote the three persons of the Godhead, since Augustine understands the persons to be terms of relation, and it is absurd that substance should be spoken relatively. On the other hand, and we really already touched on this, I'll just note it here. On the other hand, neither is the essence of God properly to be identified with substance or hypostasis. As Augustine explains, if I say God subsists so that he can be properly called a substance, then there is something in him, as it were, in a subject, and he is not simple. Right? So the simplicity of God, to which Augustine is very originally committed, right? That simplicity precludes his being a substance, because a substance implies a subject in which something inheres. It implies, in other words, a kind of internal difference between subject and predicate, or whatever. Okay, so he's not simple. That is such that to him to be is the same as anything else that is said concerning him in respect to himself, as for instance, great, omnipotent, good, and whatever of this kind is not unfitly said of God. But it is an impiety to say that God subsists and is a subject in relation to his own goodness, and that this goodness is not a substance or rather essence, and that God himself is not his own goodness, but that it is in him as in a subject. Right? So it's impious to make a distinction between God as subject and that can be predicated of him, right? Or that which inheres in him as in a subject. Right? So by the way, here, quite technically, this is something that cannot be overemphasized in the light of what happens in the next 1,500 years. Augustine has, despite the fact that he's the first autobiographer, autobiography has a very different as I'm trying to insist upon, it's like swimming upstream. Auto doesn't have the connotation of self. In fact, in one of these passages, I don't know if I can pin it down now. I may have already passed over it, or maybe it comes up. Yeah, let me just show you something on page 20 to make concrete what I'm talking about. This is a purely technical point, so we don't even have to worry about the passage, but on page 20, about 10 or 11 lines down, in the quotation from Augustine's Trinity, he says, let it not then add anything to that which it knows. This is speaking of the mind. We've already alluded to this passage. The mind should not add anything to that which it knows itself to be when it is bidden to know itself, for it knows at any rate that this is said to itself, namely to the self that is and that lives and that understands, right? Well, that's talk about translation, right? To the self. Well, there is no the self in Augustine, right? The Latin is sibi. Right? In other words, it's to itself, the closer you can get in English, right? Not to the self. The author much, he has imbibed, whoever translated that, has just through osmosis gotten the notion that there is, perhaps for Augustine, just because he keeps speaking reflexively, to say that there is some kind of substantive self. Augustine has no notion of that. And in that passage, which begins on 19, notice, what is so much in the mind as the mind itself, which if you look at the Latin, is very clear, right? There's no self-reference there. Quid enim tam in mente. What is so much in mente, quam mens, right? Even in the Latin, there's no itself even itself, so I'm saying, right? So for Augustine, the mind, which for Augustine, by the way, is the soul, or the seat of the soul, is not a self, right? Now, the mind can know itself, right? It can reflect upon itself, right? But not as a self, you see? So what I'm getting at is, analogously, going back here to what triggered that, this whole business about God not being a substance or a subject, you see? This is thoroughgoing in Augustine's thinking, that there is no, well, let's put it this way, to the extent to which God is the paradigm, you see, of a mind, right? It's clear that the divine mind, certainly, is absolutely not a subject. Do you see that? Absolutely not a substance means to him absolutely not a subject. And you could say analogously to the extent to which the human mind, you say, is in the image of the Creator, right? To that extent, it also, right, is not a subject, right? Even though it has a reflexive moment, it is not substantively any more a subject than the divine exemplary mind is, right? That's
what at this point does a subject mean for it to not be it, since it's taken the whole course of Western thought, at least up through Hegel, in order to get a clear picture of what that is?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, in other words, in our understanding of what the self is,
right,
what the subjectivity is, that we begin to see from
right,
Aquinas to Descartes, through Kant to Hegel, we get a pretty clear picture of the subject as that which is the seat of the representations and has also a representation of itself.
Okay.
Okay, now, what does it mean to say Augustine doesn't have that, since clearly the movement towards that is coming from the development of exactly these little Latinate particles, which though they don't
Right,
create a substantive nominative autos as a noun, they do have ses and sibes and ipsums and se ipsums and so on.
And the question is?
The question is that what does it mean to say that there is no idea of a self, even though it's reflexive?
Well,
the reflexivity is in fact the germ of the self.
I think I specified it more carefully. I'm not saying unqualified there's no idea of a self.
Okay.
I'm saying there's no idea of a substantive self. Whatever self is reflexive.
In other words, the English translation makes it sound as if we've already gotten to the end
the
of the
self.
story.
The self. Yeah, I mean, it makes it a noun. There's no noun of a self. Okay, and that's not incidental. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that the modern self came out of nowhere, because yes, there is a reflexivity here. Yeah, absolutely. And it's even more pronounced in Aquinas, ironically, since Aquinas is even more original than Augustine, I think, intellectually. Part of his originality allows him, maybe he got distracted by the essay, allows him to think of God in what are much more closely self-conscious terms. Right? Yeah. No, yeah. So no, I'm not saying there's no development. I'm just saying you cannot take back the modern notion of a substantive self or subject and put it back into Augustine. That's an uncritical move to make. That's all I want to say. But I think it's worth saying, if you look at these translations, especially the latest translation of the Trinity, which is not this one, is just rampant with that kind of substantive use of the word self. Okay. All right. So toward the bottom of, and Augustine is nice. His choice of language. It's very. He has the great advantage of being an initiator and somewhat, you'll pardon me for saying, unself-conscious and not burdened by things that become critical later on. So when he speaks of God, there in the 2/3 of the way down page 13, he refers to God as id ipsum, right? I mean, Freud would love this, I think. It might give Freud a problem, but it's very nice, right? It's the it itself, the it. God is the it, right? Now, what I'm playing with there is, I don't think this was a setup. This was just providentially a gift. But on page 1, my rendition of Aristotle's essence and species and existence and so forth is, I cast it in terms of it. It's it and it is, right? Okay, that kind of thing. And as I say, happily, not by any particular contrivance, certainly no conscious contrivance, it turns out, of course, that Augustine, when he's trying to say something about this ultimate thing, that's exactly what he says, right? He says, in effect, God is the thing itself. It's the it itself, right? Whereas you'll notice that Thomas's equivalent natural way of speaking is esse ipsum. You see, the act to be itself, whereas Augustine's it. So what I'm taking advantage of there, in an otherwise subtly distinct realm between the two thinkers, is that even though they're both, here's the way I put it, in fact it probably comes out somewhere over on, yeah it does, it's great to read your own text because it really makes you think. And on page 14, I say, in the 4th line, speaking of the essence, August's understanding of God as the essence, who transcends the participatory identity of essence and esse in the form of it itself, it ipsum, the absolute identity of esse, essence and esse, okay? Then I noticed, I'm reading through this, and I go down, now I'm contrasting the ipsum esse of Aquinas, which I've just referred to, and in the 8th line, perfectly in parallel with what I've just said about Augustine, I say, in the form of the esse itself, the absolute identity of essence and esse, right? In other words, there's the problem, and it's not a problem. I mean, or, there's the problem, and to anticipate my friend Jim's jumping on me, and it's not a mistake. That's the problem. For both Augustine and Thomas, God is the absolute identity of essence and esse. For both of them, that's true. It's within that absolute identity of essence and esse that there appears to be, historically, room to maneuver. And the maneuver is that in the absolute identity of essence and esse that Augustine understands, he understands that the primacy of essentia, of essence, of the itness, to go back to my rendition of Aristotle at the opening of chapter 1, right? God is the it itself. That is, God, as he says explicitly elsewhere, God is, properly speaking, the only essence. God is, he might have said, I don't think he ever says it quite this way, he might have easily said, God is essentia ipsum. Right? He might, I'm wondering, well, it depends on the context. No, because sometimes the gender is overridden by the philosophical context. So I don't know what he would have said. But anyway, the point being, he means ipsum essentia, ipsum id. That's what I'm saying. Even though he's not going to distinguish the esse of God, the being of God, from his essence. And Thomas, who is in the same agreement, they're absolutely identical, I'm saying, yes, but within that identity, the difference is the primacy of esse over essentia, right? So it ipsum is not an accidental, right? I mean, it may have been, I just have the gut feeling, it was perfectly spontaneous on Augustine's part. It was not contrived, it's just spontaneous. Because as he tells us, for him, God is essentia. But for Thomas, yes, God is essentia, of course, absolutely, no question about it. But strictly speaking, within that identity, esse trumps essentia. Right? It's as if there is, for Thomas, there is no divine essence other than the act of being itself. Right? Whereas you might say, it might be a little unfair to Augustine to read it backwards, but for Augustine, there is no act of God's being other than the essence itself. It's that kind of thing, but it's not an insignificant, if overly subtle distinction.
In Augustine and in the early Latin, tell me this isn't right, it just rolls over running. The weight of the existentia being the same as the essentia is that in a Platonic context, the existentia would be an instance of the essence. So you don't have an independent notion of existence as an action, as an act. Whereas in Aquinas, it's not that it's an instance. You have to actually read that back into it, as we did 2 courses ago, to say that, well, in a sense, the act of being of beings in nature is a kind of participation, but it's no longer a participation in essence, it's a participation in act. That the way in which,
I think that's...
So that that's a way in which that difference, the difference of the samenesses, the difference of the equation, essence.
Yeah, and if I'm hearing you correctly, then Augustine would be saying implicitly that God is that essence that is its own instance.
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I have no problem with that.
One more quick thing. You said that the simplicitas in Augustine is unique and that's original. But I think it's coming from a passage in Plotinus in which Plotinus uses haplos and haplotetes, most haplos, and not hen. And it's exactly where he's saying, well, maybe what I could say is, it's not even one. What we could get a sense of it from what the Pythagoreans say about Apollo, that Apollo means palu. That is, Apollo is the not many.
Right.
And so, and it's because what it maintains is its most simple.
Right, and I think that passage is actually quoted. I don't know whether I quote the Greek at that point, but you're right. Plotinus does use haplos, which means simple. Simple at first, I think.
It could mean first.
Protos. And but I still want to claim originality for Augustine precisely because of the alpha privative nature of the one simplicity. Right? In other words, the simplicity of the Trinity is such that it is not privative of the relations of Father, Son, and Spirit, and it's absolutely not privative of the act of creation. And then if you really want to push it, it's not privative, it's not an alternative to incarnation, contact with the world, in my way of reading Augustine. So, yes, there is a kind of simplicity.
Yeah, right? Okay, it's just that Plotinus is not being terminological. He's being beyond terminological, trying to indicate something. And so he does it as it were.
Okay. All right.
What is the word you're using? Privative?
Alpha privative means
that
means negative in front of something.
Okay.
I'm trying to think. Give me an alpha privative word.
Amorphous.
Which is an English version of a Greek word, right? So the alpha is the Latin version of in. Infinite is not finite, and amorphous is not shaped. Right? So the privative means, I was using it in a little awkward way. I just meant to say that the simplicity of the Trinity is not at the expense of, it's not being deprived of some kind of multiplicity in the Augustinian sense. All right, now Thomas not only shifts within the identity. That's the way you would have to put it, I guess. He shifts the balance to esse from essentia within the otherwise absolute identity of the two in the notion of the Godhead. But the implications of this are not only have to do with his understanding of God, but in the middle of page 14, I say Thomas understands the divine act of being to infinitely transcend all participatory identity and particularity of being. So among the proofs that God has created ex nihilo, he says, diverse things have diverse matters. I won't read through the whole thing for the sake of time, but toward the conclusion of that paragraph, about 4 or 5 lines from the end of that paragraph, he says, hence there is no one prime matter which is in potentiality to universal being, but God is universally productive of the total being of things. Okay? So in other words, notice, here's another really interesting departure from Aristotle. Now, of course, Aristotle didn't have the problem because he didn't have a creator God. Okay? But when God becomes the actus purus, the ipsum esse, the act of being itself, and as such is understood to be the creator, he becomes, in Thomas's mind, the creator of the whole, the totality of being. All right? And notice, for Thomas, that means that's a corollary of the fact that there is no universal matter. All right? In other words, if God is, as he is for Thomas, the universal agent, the universal doer, right? If he is the, I don't want to say energeia because it's probably too weak, but if he is, see, that's it. He's he's beyond energeia, right? Because energeia is actuality. Energeia is essentia, but esse, you see? Esse, the act of being, is beyond actuality, energeia. Do you see? And what is the corollary, whether it's in Aristotle or in Plato or Plotinus, the corollary of energeia is matter. And if I have a universal energeia, then I've got a universal matter. And Thomas is very clear. There is no universal matter. Sorry. Now that, see, and in a certain backdoor sense, he introduces a little bit of the Aristotelian problematic again, right? Because Aristotle was a particularist. And in his own way, God, the creator God, the universal agent, not being the actuality corresponding to a universal potentiality, you see, therefore he can't be. Now to close a little circle here, he's not the beginning and the end of the universe of Thomas either. He's not the actuality of the universe. The beginning and the end, this two-way street, the Platonian two-way street. See? He's not that. He's altogether beyond actuality, energeia, and the proof of that, so to speak, non-rhetorical proof, the logical proof of that, is that there is no universal matter that you would expect if God were a universal actuality. So he's not the universal actuality of things. He's not the actualizing energy that emanates or otherwise produces by continuity with itself the universe of creatures. So, not being such, there being no universal matter, then think about the implications of this. Then anything that God creates, any and all things that God creates, yes, there's no potentiality, but whatever potentiality they have as being forms, combinations of form and matter, the matter is not a piece of a universal matter. It's radically particularized. So this is a very deep insight of Thomas, which helps us understand how he could actually say, it's fundamental to his explanation of how things are, that matter is the principle of individuality. I mean, you would at first sight you would say turning Aristotle upside down on his head, because I've been trying to stress in here that no matter how we think, thanks to Thomas, the individuality of something in Aristotle is its essence. It is a particular because of its eternal essential being, right? Not because of its matter. Its matter it shares in common with everything else. But in Thomas, there is no matter to be shared in common. So God is the creator of the totality of everything, of the whole thing. But everything is created in toto implies that the matter of those things which are a combination of form and matter, or of actuality and potentiality, that potentiality is a particularity. Right?
But how does that square? And I only use that term rhetorically.
Well, be careful, because I take squaring seriously.
I understand that. I'm using it rhetorically. How does that square with matter being the body itself?
Well, I think it squares very well, because the body itself and the thinking now occurring is an absolute differentiation of bodies.
See, is it?
It's not a totality. It's not just that the circle is not a continuous circle.
But to the extent that the body is the body of Christ.
Correct.
Right. And Christ is God. And according to Aquinas, God stands in no need of matter. I don't know whether that means he's alien to matter or was, and
Well, I don't know what
could be
alien
now. Yeah, but just how do you square this statement? You don't have to, but I mean, is there a way of squaring the statement of Aquinas with the thought in the new thinking that matter is the body itself, including the body of Christ?
Yes, because the body itself, in the thinking now occurring, is not a totality of parts. It's a relationship of particulars, each of which is absolutely a particular, without, as it were, any need for a totalization.
But this is all facilitated by the body of Christ, isn't it?
What is the it in that sense?
The rationality of having these particular bodies
Right.
without.
Yeah, the body of Christ is the embodiment of the, if I could put it that way, of the other bodies, such that they have this kind of perfect independence in existence.
Right.
That's right. But let me just, we have to stop, but since we're this close, I just want to jump over to the middle of page 15, where Thomas says, SCG, a little above the middle, 221.9, nothing whose being is finite can be like another of the same genus or species, except as regards the nature of the genus or the species. For each single being, so far as it is this particular thing, is distinct from every other one. Therefore, nothing whose being is finite can be the efficient cause of another, except as regards its possession of a genus or species, not as regards its subsisting as distinct from others. Right? Hence, that by which the effect of a finite agent subsists as an individual is the necessary precondition of such an agent's action. Therefore, it does not create. Right? In other words, what he's saying there is that, and this follows from everything else he says here and elsewhere, right? That the universal agent, not beginning with a universal matter, creates the totality of being, and therefore, if there's no universal matter, what I'm saying is that the matter of each of the creatures is peculiar to it, it's particular to it, and what he's saying is that even though those creatures fall into an intelligible arrangement of genus and species, right? Nevertheless, their actual hoc aliquid is what he says, the this something that each thing is. Go back to, again, page 1 of this chapter, right? The totality in Aristotelian language. See, Aristotle just took it for granted that every essence was the totality. He had no explanation for the totalitiness of things. He had, right, what Aquinas is saying is that the totalitiness of things is caused by the Creator as such. Right? So any man can make a man. It happens all the time. Right? But no man can make this man in its thisness, in the language of thinking now occurring, in its absolute particularity. Right? So the absolute particularity of thinking now occurring is the analog of the point that Aquinas is making here with the hoc aliquid, that is the presupposition of any natural creation, or in his language, of any natural production, which is not creation. Creation is precisely for Aquinas the making of the thisness of something.